Welcome to Elevating Consciousness, the podcast that helps you discover deeper levels of truth, meaning, and wholeness. I'm your host, Artem, and our guest today is a clinical psychologist, professor, and theorist. He teaches courses on integrative unified psychotherapy as well as personality, social, and cognitive psychology at James Madison University. He also regularly engages in pro bono clinical work and supervises doctoral students in their development. Most notably, he has spent over 20 years developing an integrative framework of psychology, which he outlined in his 2011 book, A New Unified Theory of Psychology. His most recent book, A New Synthesis for Solving the Problem of Psychology, further builds on his work and introduces UTOK, a unified theory of knowledge. Gregg Henriques, welcome to the show.
It's very good to be here. Thank you for having me.
For sure. So before we start, I just want to set a bit of context. Although I'm not a clinician myself, I've been studying psychology for years, and I do culture and leadership development at a psychotherapy startup. So I'm very much entrenched in the mental health space. And I ran across your work a while ago, and it took me some time to really sit down and dive into it. But once I did, I can certainly say it was worth the time and effort. The overview you give and the way you tie the field together is fascinating, and it's not something I've come across before. So I'd love for you to share some of the key aspects of your framework with the audience, but maybe you can first start by explaining what the problem of psychology is.
Sure, absolutely. Thanks for that. I'm glad you dabbled a little bit in both psychotherapy and my work, and I appreciate that. So let's take a little time and think about the problem of psychology, okay? So when I use the word psychology, I'm referring to sort of an institutional in a frame that emerges in the context of science. And by science here, I'm really, to be precise in my wording, I'm referring to the modern empirical natural science that emerged like Galileo into Newton. Okay, because there are other kinds of uses of that term. Aristotle was doing science at some level, but there are particular kind of science emerged that gave us our modern considerations of physics, for example, and was able to map mathematically matter in motion, and then gives us rise to sort of an understanding of the universe that ultimately then more and more disciplines we're trying to plug into. So when we built into chemistry, and eventually you get Darwin's theory, you get cell theory, that plugs into biology. So in the middle of the 19th century, people started to think, well, there's this mind process, whatever. There are a lot of different terms, psyche and soul, mind and consciousness, etc. And people started to apply them tried to bring the scientific way of knowing to this domain called the mental or mind, okay? And so we were going to then build a science of psychology, place psychology on top of biology, which is then on top of physics, or on top of chemistry, on top of physics, etc. Makes good sense. Indeed, Auguste Comte, who had developed a hierarchy, he put sociology on top. He skipped over psychology. It's interesting that he did. But anyway, we had seen an emerging hierarchy of sciences and have a sense of that in terms of, hey, you go from physics to biology to psychology to sociology. That's pretty well established. If you give yourself some time, you're like, how do I learn stuff? And like, yeah, that's true. Okay, at some level. But then you actually get into my discipline in particular. And what you see in the history of my discipline is the emergence of a wide variety of different schools of thought, okay? There are schools of thought that are emphasizing, say, experimental methodology, okay? A guy by the name of Hermann Ebbinghaus started to explore his own memory and develop nonsense symbols and tried to remember them and elucidated a forgetting curve. So he had a methodology that he started. Guy by the name of Francis Galton, who's known for eugenics and other kinds of notions, developed a behavioral science statistical method where he started to correlate things like general intelligence across families. And so those are some methods-based stuff. You have the founder of psychology, Wilhelm Wundt in Germany, developing a systematic approach of introspection, where you would look at the contents of your conscious experience and report on them. And he would train people to become observers of their own conscious experience. We'll call that structuralism. Wundt didn't call it structuralism. But structuralism is the idea that psychology is about studying the stuff behind your eyes, the conscious experience behind your eyes. And that's what structuralism becomes. It's human conscious experience. And then there were other people like William James that was like, it's not so much, although conscious experience is super important, it's really the mental life of animals and humans and the way they adjust and adapt. That's called functionalism. So functionalism is what's the functional patterns in the world versus structuralism, what's the makeup of conscious experience. You then get things like Freud, who comes along and after the turn of the century, but starts to really look at unconscious experiences in humans and how that relates to psychopathology. So we have to analyze our unconscious. Our self-conscious system is rationalizing. So he points to a new concept called unconscious. Other people had pointed to that for sure, but his whole system then is about systematically studying the unconscious. You get the behaviorists, and they are like, hey, all of this mental talk is not fitting in the physical universe. It's like talking like God. What we need to do is we need to pair stimulus and responses in the laboratory and look at animal stimulus responses. Okay, I could go on, but I think I've made my point. That is that to tackle the domain of the mental from a wide variety, what you get is a wide variety of different perspectives. Okay, structuralism, functionalism, behaviorism, psychoanalysis, and then methods-based approaches. And these schools compete with each other, and it becomes obvious to everybody in the turn of the century, and Lev Vygotsky writes brilliantly on this in 1927, where he's reviewing some people who've already labeled it's called the crisis of our field. The crisis of psychology is the fact that psychology isn't referring to one thing in the world, okay? So you get a stimulus response pattern, functional mental activity that manifests both in consciousness and animal and human behavioral activity, subconscious experience of being, methods-based analyses, okay? All those are totally different ideas about what the thing is. And now we can contrast that with biology. Of course, there's all this different approach to biology, but biology is like about life. The thing in the world that biology is about is living organisms. And the thing that chemistry is about is the structure of matter and how it chemically manifests and change. And the thing that physics is about is energy and matter across scale, okay, and the behavior of that. So the natural sciences, and it's true, geology is true of astronomy, the thing in the world that they're about is quite clear, okay, when you go beneath psychology. So you got to just drop into neuroscience. Oh, we study the nervous system in the brain. Okay, then we go into, and we can go on, and you get what I call the ontological referent. Ontology is a fancy word for the reality that you're talking about. The ontological referent in the world is agreed upon when you go from physics to chemistry to biology, okay? When you get to psychology, all of that dissipates. Okay? There's a profound dissipation of coherence about the thing our language is referring to in the world, so much so there's actually an agreement in the field, if you know how to look at its history, that there will never be agreement. I'll say that again. There's agreement in the field that there will not be agreement in the field about what we mean about the term of psychology. Okay? That's the problem of psychology. Why does our ontological coherence break down completely when we try to place psychology on top of biology in the natural sciences? Why does that happen? And why has it happened for so long? And why did it become such a historical problem? And then why did my field decide it wasn't a problem and fail to tell all the Psych 101 students out there that, by the way, we used to believe this was a serious problem. I think if you think about it, it should be a serious problem for science. And now we bury that problem as a discipline. We pretend it's not a problem at all. And we pat people like me on the head when I asked this question when I was undergrad. Don't worry about it. That's a misguided question. Well, I think it's a very, very important question. So that's the problem of psychology. The ontological ground disappears when we get to my discipline, psychology, about what the consensus is that the practitioners and scientists of the thing called psychology say psychology refers to in the world.
Yeah, so, your model works to resolve this problem, and maybe we could get to that in a second, but maybe I want to touch on the fact that psychology is often referred to as a soft science, and some people even say that it's a pseudoscience, and it's not taken seriously by many scientists. You state in your work that psychology is fundamental to all knowledge. So why do you believe that psychology is fundamental to all knowledge?
Well, I'll take your first point. I agree that the reason, what I think people are actually referring to when they call it a soft science is this problem, that really a mature science has some degree of consensual gripping about the thing in the world. So chemistry with its periodic table of the elements and atomic theory of matter, you can debate what really an electron is, but you have a grip as a chemist about what the hell you're talking about. And psychology doesn't, okay? So psychology is, and that's the problem, and that's why it's soft in the sense you try to get a hold of it, and unlike a molecule that is complicated in some ways, but you can grab a hold of, you don't know what you're grabbing a hold of. So that's the softness. And if everybody has different definitions and the science that you're doing is technically, to use Thomas Kuhn's reference of what a true paradigm is, it's pre-paradigmatic. Well, if you never achieved a paradigm, you can argue from a hard natural science view that you're not a real science. So I can be sympathetic to that view. Then the question is, okay, it is the case that in my history, if you look at the history of my life and journey, it starts with what I would later call the problem of psychotherapy. So you talked about psychotherapy. So when you do psychotherapy, you sit with somebody, right? And they present their problems, and you have to have some kind of knowledge and some kind of value structure that enters into your relationship with them and gives them some feedback that hopefully orients them towards the alleviation of suffering and more adaptive living at some level. Okay? So what is the knowledge that I am going to use? This is the problem. What is the knowledge system that I'm going to use? And is it up to the task of being a psychotherapist? Okay? What I discovered in the mid-1990s, in my estimation, is the answer when I asked, well, I should be grounded in the science of human psychology to do psychological therapy. And then when I realized the shit show, of confusion that psychological science is, I realized that the knowledge systems really aren't structured to be up to the task of doing what I wanted to do as a psychological doctor. They don't do justice to both the claims about fact and value to guide me. Okay, so there you go in terms of some of that structure. I have since come to evolve my system into something that addresses the problem of psychology with a unified theory of psychology. It builds into, then returns to the original problem and says, well, if there was a unified theory of psychology that's up to the task, this is how you would then apply that lens, and this is what you would elucidate to delineate what psychotherapy ought to be framed around. Okay? And then the final thing, which I can really get into, is actually our entire knowledge structure, our entire structure of core understanding, following the emergence of science, broke in some ways. What do I mean? Well, as science physics gets unbelievably powerful and science gets tied to technology, where we have a grounding in a particular kind of epistemology where people are like, oh my God, physics, now we really know shit. Okay? And that's true. I'm very impressed with a lot of the knowledge that physics ultimately generates, although it's got its own problems, but it identifies a whole core of very powerful knowledge. But as that knowledge accumulates, it is split off from our subjective and social knowing, meaning scientific knowledge grounds itself into a particular set of frames that don't mesh well with the subjective mental and socially constructed realities, and it isn't structured to place mind in right relationship to it. Okay? So this is what I call the Enlightenment Gap. The Enlightenment Gap is the failure to develop a coherent, basic shared understanding of the world that places matter and mind in right relation. The terminology for that's the mind-body problem, and clarifies what scientific knowledge tells us about the world relative to subjective and social knowledge. Okay, so the Enlightenment Gap is the failure for us to have a philosophical system that places those things, mind-body, and the nature of scientific knowledge relative to subjective and social knowledge in right relation. UTOK, as its broadest view, the unified theory of knowledge, resolves the Enlightenment Gap. Okay, so it places in right relation mind relative to matter, and it clarifies the nature of scientific knowledge and what it says about the universe, and it clarifies that in relationship to subjective and social knowledge to hand us a system of understanding that puts the natural sciences, subjectivity, and ultimately collective wisdom in a coherent relation.
Yeah, I think now that you brought up the mind-body thing, the mind-body problem, and this is one of the questions that I wanted to ask before we kind of unpack the unified theory of psychology, is what is mind? And also, do you distinguish mind from consciousness? How do you think about mind?
Lovely. Yes. We have a poor vocabulary for mind, and I introduce a number of different words. So we actually need to enrich our vocabulary. Okay. So the first thing I point to in the world from a scientist perspective is that I introduce a concept called capital M mind. Okay. And really what it points to in the world is mindedness, which is, and I'll get to this, so just hang with me for a second. Mind in the world has the property of mindedness and is identifiable through what's called mental behavioral patterns. Okay? What's a mental behavioral pattern? A mental behavioral pattern is a sensory motor loop, okay, inside an animal that yields or results in a functional awareness and responsivity from an animal, okay, relative to its sensory and motor structure, okay? Let's make this super simple. Go out into the woods and watch the birds and the bees, okay? Watch the squirrels, okay? What are they doing? They're sensing and moving, and they're sensing and moving, behaving in a way that's radically different than the plants and the bacteria. That is the difference. So you can factor out living and leave behind the higher order mental behavioral patterns of animals. We call it animal behavior. That's not the right term. It is the cat that animals exhibited. It's mindedness. Okay? Mindedness is the sensory motor looping structure that enables animals essentially to get up and move around. Okay? So the first thing that we have to do is have to know that mindedness is a different kind of behavior pattern than livingness. So you have living organisms and minded animals. All right? And this is called mindedness, and I have a theory called behavioral investment theory, okay, which says, hey, we can frame the neurocognitive sensory motor looping of animals as essentially what they're doing is they're calculate the expenditure of the behavior of the animal as a whole, trying to expend work effort and make predictions about what they can get out of the environment relative to survival and reproductive success. Okay? So mind now here is defined as the set of minded behavior. So that's one definition of capital M mind. Okay? Now, if your audience is thinking, well, wait a minute. Okay, audience is immediately going to say, hey, there's two other kinds of ideas here, at least, that I want to talk about. When you say the word mind, I mean that shit that Wundt was talking about, that stuff behind your eyes. That's when you go asleep, it goes offline and you wake up and then you have all these weird experiences, right? It's like, hey, you're tasting coffee right now. Okay? That's called, in my system, that's called mind 2. Okay? Mind 2 refers to the subjective conscious experience of being in the world, and it emerges from mindedness, at least as far as we're aware, okay? And essentially, we can then talk about how we think it happens that way, okay? But it has a unique properties, so mind 2 is only available to be observed inside out. I'll say that again. You can only see mind 2 inside out, okay? So that's an interesting thing about it. It's like, it's very hard for me to see your mind 2 directly. Okay? So that's one other meaning of mind 2, which is subjective conscious experience. And then some other people will be in the René Descartes tradition, be like, well, wait a minute. What about all this reasoning that you're doing? What about I think, therefore I am, you're justifying? In fact, only humans really have this kind of mind, and you had to get socialized into the world, and now you can think and be self-recursively, should I drink this? Do I have free will in drinking this? And am I consciously aware of my world? Well, in UTOK, this is mind 3. Okay, mind 3 is mediated by is self-conscious reflection mediated by reason giving and justification. This is Rene Descartes' mind. Okay? So notice we have mind with a capital M that comes out of life, the properties of which are mindedness. You can see from an exterior perspective all the sensory motor looping that animals engage in. Mind one is the neurocognitive activity and the functional behavioral activity. Mind two is somewhere in the animal kingdom, a subjective conscious experience emerges. In houseflies, maybe. Definitely in dogs. Okay, somewhere between houseflies and dogs. And maybe even we can get further down in or further. There are lots of interesting questions about where mind two would emerge. And then in humans, and yes, there is early self-conscious awareness in other animals, but in humans this takes off. And you get self-conscious justification, and in higher another layer of mentation through reason giving, mediated by symbolic syntactical human language, it gives rise to a whole nother structure. Okay? So now when you say mind, what mind are you talking about? Are you talking about neurocognitive activity inside the organism or between the animal? The behaviorists were, hey, that was stimulus response, that's outside the animal. That's technically called, in my language, mind 1B. What is the neurocognitive activity that the brain is actually doing when it's just sitting there running through that's mind 1A. If there's a conscious experience of being, that's mind 2. If there's a self-conscious justifier, that's mind 3. And if that can be shared, like I'm sharing with you now, that's mind 3B. Mind 3A, private, mind 3B, public. So now what we have is the mind 3s and the A-B structure tells us where we're talking about, which one, and which referent epistemologically, meaning what vantage point. So mind 2 is inside, out. All the mind 1B and mind 3B, that's outside in. Okay? So notice now, you like, what's the mind? It's like, well, there's a lot of different things in there. Let's get clear about what the referent is using mind 1, 2, 3.
Yeah, that's fascinating the way you frame that and really break it up into several different pieces. I'm curious, how do you understand consciousness? How do you understand the word consciousness? What does consciousness mean? Is that mind one, that very simple kind of basic awareness?
Right. Yep. So this is called consciousness in its broadest sense can be defined as functional awareness and responsivity. Functional awareness and responsivity. This is, by the way, if you're familiar with like integrated information theory, IIT, they try to get into, and this gets into what's called panpsychism. Functional awareness and responsivity, clearly, if we define consciousness this way, then plants are conscious in this way. Plants clearly exhibit a functional awareness and responsivity to the environment. The plant bends to the sun. Okay? The plants will seek out their roots and go towards food sources and go away from toxins. Bacteria do this too. Okay? Plants, bacteria, fungi demonstrate clearly functional awareness and responsivity. Okay? All right? And all we mean is that the system internalizes some aspect, adjusts its behavior accordingly, and has some kind of vague learning memory function to demonstrate that it's functionally tracking a stimulus response pattern. Okay? And then we say, what do we mean by conscious? Well, we mean it's aware at some level. Just like now, you can think about that. Like when you say, hey, oh my God, I went to a party, got totally hammered, and then I was out cold. I was unconscious. What do you mean when you say somebody's out cold, unconscious? They lacked functional awareness and responsivity. I went, hey, buddy, are you all right? And they didn't respond. And we were like, oh, shit, should we call 911? Is this or should we let them sleep it off? You know, if you've been at those kind of parties, thankfully I haven't for a while. Okay. But what we mean there is the guy's unconscious, right? He's not responding. And then we have to decide whether we're in deep trouble. Then all of a sudden, if he wakes up, now he demonstrates functional awareness and responsivity. Because he's a human, we presume that as he demonstrates functional awareness and responsivity, his subjective conscious experience is coming online too. He's waking up on the inside. And we have good confidence in this because we have mind 3, where we can ask him, dude, how are you feeling? You know? Okay. Now, our animal friends, this is much harder. It's much, much harder to understand where exactly mind 2 is in our animal friends because they don't have mind 3. And you can't ask your dog or your kid, if you have kids, when they were colicky, my kids get, I wish I knew when you're 6 months old, what's bugging you? What is your mind to experience at 6 months? Well, we don't have direct access to that. So consciousness sometimes refers to awakened responsivity from the outside. That's the broadest definition. You can see that from the outside, and that meaning can all the way go down to plants. Okay. Then there's animal functional awareness and responsivity. That's mind one. Okay. I prefer to use the term consciousness for mind two. And this gets into the philosophy of consciousness. That's the subjective experience of being, which, by the way, turns also into the hard problem of consciousness. And we can talk about that. What they actually mean is, what exactly are the mechanisms of this neurobiological field structure that somehow goes from the water of your brain to the wine of subjective experience. And that's mind one to mind two. So if you're familiar with David Chalmers at all, he talks about the easy problem. Well, that's mind one. Okay. And then the hard problem, that's mind two. And I would say that there's a lot of evidence that suggests that while plants are conscious in the parallel to mind one sense, functional awareness and responsivity, there's no really good reason to believe, at least that I'm aware of, that plants are conscious in the mind two sense. Like, that is something like to be a tree, and they get pissed off if you start cutting them down. Okay, that's that to me. I think you need a brain for mind two. Okay, this type of experiences. Does that make sense? Okay,
for sure.
All right. The last thing I'll say is one last point about self-conscious. So then self-conscious corresponds quite a bit to mind three. That's actually, I am now aware of myself. And by the way, this then is going to bring in your strange loop of awareness and things like free will, and say, did I really choose to join this podcast, or was it an inevitable unfolding of deterministic causation, etc.? You get into that kind of, now you're in mind three, self-conscious reflection, and you get issues of like the freedom of my will to both be aware and decide where it's going, etc. Okay.
Yeah, that might be interesting to discuss free will, but maybe we'll just move to the unified theory of psychology, and in particular, the four pieces. You've already mentioned behavioral investment theory a little bit. That's piece number one. Piece number two is the influence matrix. Piece number three is the justification hypothesis. And piece number four is the tree of knowledge system. What does each of these pieces consist of, and how do they fit together? And I understand that this is obviously a complex system that you can speak for hours about, but kind of give an overview just to kind of give a basic understanding.
Well, let's work from the backwards one there, at least. We'll start from the tree of knowledge. Okay?
Yeah, we can do that. Cool.
And so the tree of knowledge, the first thing you have to kind of get in your head is just think about, if you know a little bit of physics, okay, you know that in the 20th century, physics and astronomy, or cosmology, revealed that the universe kind of begins with a big bang, okay? The specifics of that are still open to debate, but you can basically suggest with a lot of confidence that if you were to run the tape back, okay, and imagine a vacuum point, you could suck the entire universe all the way back into a single point. It would take you 13.8 billion years, and it would suck all the matter, the space, and the time into this point. Okay? In other words, the point that you and I sit on is 13.8 billion years later. Okay? There's been an unfolding. Okay? So the first thing that you want for the tree of knowledge, and understand that our observable universe does kind of have a beginning. Okay? There's a lot of rich debate at a sophisticated level, but there's a huge amount of confidence that the basic outline is right. The universe explodes into being, and don't take that too literally, okay? But it really is, there's an energy information thing, and it transforms and it starts to freeze. That's the best way to think about it. And matter is chunked and frozen energy that then gives rise to an expansive matter dimension of space and time. And then that matter and dimension, space and time, is the shit that Newton starts to map with matter and motion stuff, okay? Like circling around a planet and rocks falling to the earth and all that stuff. So you can map matter and motion coming out of this energy thing, okay? So if you have that in your head, then you're sort of like, okay, you have what's called the time dimension, okay? Now, in addition to what we know, here you and I are having a goddamn conversation somehow 13.8 billion years ago. What happened, right? Well, we can actually know that first there was just matter, and there were atoms, and then on planet Earth, atoms about 4 billion years ago, there was a lot going on planet Earth, and there were a lot of complicated molecules. And somehow there was a spark of life, okay? So a spark of life happened, and we can get into why and what that really means, but basically you get protocells into cells, maybe seeded from an even asteroid, who knows, whatever. You get the explosion of bacteria, okay? Now, bacteria are not like molecules. Bacteria are really complicated little biochemical, computational machines that are complex adaptive systems, okay? What does that mean? They have a lot of complicated self-organizing parts, okay? They basically are oriented towards survival and reproduction, all right? And they manage the flow of energy, information, matter in a functional way. They exhibit complex functional design, functional awareness, okay? But we can argue that emerges from variation, selection, retention, natural process. We have a model for that, okay? And then you can fast forward billions of years, literally. There's a billion years where it's just prokaryotic or bacteria kinds of cells. And then some weird thing happens where where one cell basically looks like it eats another. And that's the jump, what's called eukaryotic. So then cells basically go from, and now they're much more complicated than molecules, but now they go from simple cells to complicated cells or complex cells. And then these complex cells can form multicellular organisms, okay? These are called eukaryotic cells. They have a nucleus in them. And then what they do is they get together, and not only are they doing colonies, like bacteria will form colonies and but now they build tight organisms that differentiate their parts, and then they grow into things like fungi and plants, okay? And so now you have multicellular organisms that are very complex. They're grounded in eukaryotic cells. And then you start to get a system of detection of sensation and motor movement. And ultimately, in what's called the Cambrian explosion, about 550 million years ago, there's a tremendous transformation in the organization of animal body plans. They go from things like planaria worms, which have like a bilateral body plan and a brain, and are right at the base of mindedness in the tree of knowledge. And then they explode into brain-based complex active bodies that essentially look like crabs. Okay, lobsters, as Jordan Peterson will say, lobsters are like 400 million goddamn years old. Okay, so these things are super old, 500 million years ago. And what's amazing is they come onto the scene in geologically a super short period of time. That's why it's called the Cambrian explosion. So this is the explosion of the universe. There's the explosion of life onto the universe. That happened probably in a pretty quick, a couple 100 million years, which in this time frame. And then the explosion of what I'm going to call mind, which are these complex, active-bodied, brain-regulated systems, which are then engaging very likely in things like prey and predation, okay? So animals can eat each other and animals can run away, and then you get what's called an arms race. That, in the unified theory language, is the dimension of mind. I always talked about that, okay? And then we see the evolution of things like crabs over a 500 million year period all the way up to things like chimpanzees 5 million years ago. Okay, this is the dimension of mind. The dimension before is the dimension of life. The dimension before is the dimension of matter. So you get material objects, living organisms, now minded animals. And then about 500,000 years ago, you get a transformation in the human organization. So we split off from chimps 7 to 6 million years ago. But we're living pretty chimp-like 5 million years ago, 4 million years ago. We start making cool hand axes and doing weird shit. And I'm sure the archaeological evidence will be, continuing to reveal some richness. But it's in the last 500 and then 50,000 years. Notice we're doing on increments of 10. That's kind of interesting. That's 5 million years ago, and then 50 million years ago, 500 million ago, 5 billion, and now 550,000 years ago. By 50,000 years ago, our species was already in the process of differentiating. Okay. And then what happens is we get together for collective intelligence, and we develop two key lines that are transformative. One is this, what we're doing right now, the talking line. And the other thing that we do is we develop complex tools that evolve themselves. So we get complex tools technology. Other animals have simple tools. We build evolving complex tools on the one hand, and then we build evolving talking systems, which I call justification systems, on the other. And as we build these justifications, we're building a mind 3 on top of our mind 1, 2, and we're creating a collective mind, what I call capital C culture, and the culture person plane of existence, which is the capacity to enter into dialogue with each other and justify our actions on the social stage and be held accountable if you fuck up. Okay? And it is this actions pattern, mind 3 patterning, that is so radically different about human mentation. So human mentation is mind 1, 2, like the rest of the animals, and it's got mind 3 through a socialization process that gives rise to the this is what Rene Descartes was pointing out. Oh my God, I think, therefore I am. I'm a self-conscious justifier, okay? And ultimately, we can trail the pattern of justification, trail that as cultures building belief systems, and then unified theory trails that into philosophy, and it trails it into science as a particular kind of justification system. And the picture of the tree of knowledge, which maybe we can put up at some point, shows matter, life, mind, culture in the world, and then it shows science coming out of culture, and then proposes that the physical science should be mapping matter, the biological sciences should be mapping life, and in fact, that's pretty much the way they do. And it shows that psychology should have been mapping minded animals, and the history of it is very much, there are some psychologists that have long said exactly this point. William James's functionalism is damn close to this, okay? And that there are then the social sciences that are mapping human behavior at the culture person plane. And so what the tree of knowledge does is it gives us a map of the 4 dimensions of complexification, matter, life, mind, and culture, the 4 domains of science, and gives us a complete loop that places the knower, knowing about the world, in relationship to the world where it came from. Okay? And this is what's been missing, folks. I mean, this big picture structure is what was missing, okay? And what it does is it draws lines in the world, carves nature at its joints, to use a Plato term, and the joint points are energy to matter, that's where the Big Bang happened. Matter to life, that's where everyone knows, oh my God, what's the miracle of life? What's missing is life to minded animals at the Cambrian explosion, and then finally minded animals to culture justifying persons 550,000 years ago. Okay? And the explosion of that, and the evolution of justification into things like refined philosophy, and then science, and then ultimately science about factoring out our subjective and social knowledge and trying to yield a picture, an objective picture of matter and life, and now maybe mind and culture in a completed view. So that's the tree of knowledge system. I'll pause there and see.
Yeah, I like starting from this place, and basically the tree of knowledge describes 4 layers of complexity. On the bottom, you have matter, then you have life, then you have mind, then you have culture. And animals have mind, but humans also have animal mind. But on top of that, they also have this self-awareness aspect and this capacity for justification and interacting with each other in this kind of a more complex way. And could be understand as society or culture. So it's like that
lovely
4th layer.
Exactly.
So now,
let's just say, so each one of these things incorporates the other. So you start with energy, actually, and then matter freezes and chunks that. Life very much is actually about freezing and chunking matter at higher orders. Mind is about minded animals are living creatures. They freeze, chunk that. We're minded animals, but also culture. So each one incorporates and then it transcends the one prior to it.
Yeah, transcend and include.
Yeah, there's a little
So then, so now, how do the other pieces fit into the TOK system?
Right. So now we have, what this reveals then is that we're missing joint points. Like everyone knows, I mean, the greatest invention, one of the greatest accomplishments of the 20th century was the identification of a basic joint point. They didn't use the term, but basically biology was framed by Darwin's theory of natural selection, operating on a genetic combination to give rise to cells and organisms. It's called the modern evolutionary synthesis. Arguably one of the greatest intellectual achievements of the 20th century was the fact that we actually got a way to understand the jump from matter to life. Okay? Now, when you put that lens on, and then what I'm saying is, hey, buddy, there's 2 other joint points, okay, that we should be looking for. We should be looking for what gives rise to minded animals and what gives rise to cultured persons. And this thing says that there are joint points that are as specifiable as the jump from inanimate matter to living organisms as there are from living organisms to minded animals, and from minded animals to cultured persons. And the tree of knowledge the unified theory of psychology then says it fills in the joint point. So the first one is behavioral investment theory. Okay? Behavioral investment theory basically takes Skinner's idea. So B.F. Skinner is actually a really underappreciated theorist. He's studying animal behavior, and he basically calls himself the Darwin of psychology. People don't know this. Okay? And what he did is he said that actually, you know what's happening? As animals operate on their environment, patterns of complexity emerge based on the consequences that the animals engender. Meaning, when you do something in the world that has certain consequences, it selects, reinforces your behavior. And when you do things that have other consequences, it extinguishes that behavior. And he was very clear. He called this behavioral selection, and it's exactly analogous to natural selection. Okay? Now, what happened in the modern synthesis is that natural selection gets paired with genetics. Behavioral investment theory pairs Skinner's exterior environmental selection with a neurocognitive model that's an information processing model. Notice that genetics is like an information processing that gets married to a selection. Behavioral investment theory says Skinner's selection theory can be paired with a neurocognitive model of information processing. Now, I made this assertion back in 2003, and I'm happy to say this assertion has been confirmed, okay? And I can point to John Vervaeke. I don't know if any of your listeners know John Vervaeke, but John Vervaeke developed a recursive relevance realization model of neurocognition that fits exactly into behavioral investment theory, and I call John sometimes the inner Skinner. Why? Because his model is an inside-out cognitive model that's engaged in variation, selection, and retention. What does it do? It brings a recursive relevance realization frame, and then it recursively varies and selects what can be realized. Okay? Skinner's consequence ties immediately to John's concept of realization to create, and they're just basically inside out, outside in behavioral cognitive versions of the process by which cognition evolves through variation, selection, and retention. Okay? And this is then another way of saying this is the way mindedness, animal mindedness evolves in the world, okay, over the course of an animal's lifetime. So behavioral investment theory maps that. And thus we can really track, then we can go all the way back to the planaria worms and then get into life and then pull ourselves up so we now have continuity. Then the crabs appear and they're engaged in predation and mating. So you get crabs battling for territory. You get crabs engaged in mating. You get some vague parental care. And then there's the whole ocean animal scene for a long time. Then animals crawl out of the ocean and we start tracking, we're track the vertebrate line from fish into reptiles, okay, and then into mammals. And then we could talk about what I think is happening with mind two. Okay, that's the inner experience of animals, but we can observe all this mind one-mindedness stuff in animals. All right. And then I make the point that we get more and more social. Well, not I make the point. Other people make this point, of course. Okay. We get more and more social. And then Michael Tomasello is a great theorist. He talks about what it was, the precursors before justification that set the stage for our human capacity to sync up interpersonally. Okay. And he shows that we humans, we're unique primates, great apes, that have a capacity for shared attention and intention. Okay. That means I intuitively will track what you're paying attention to and know that you have goals. I do this before reasoning. Okay. Kids, when you point, kids, not other apes, kids look to see where you're going because they intuitively know that you have an attention and you and I can sync up our intentions, okay? And this probably what gave rise to our hunting capacities and other things. But this is before sophisticated propositional language. The influence matrix maps the human relationship system. This is the third idea. And it takes literature and personality theory, attachment theory, etc., okay? And it says what happened to the human relationship system is rather than just navigating the environment on a matrix of height and width, we actually exapted that and built a self-other matrix of understanding. where we track our place in the world in a dynamic, process-oriented view. And we cut across relational roles like parent-child, cooperative, to create an intrapsychic, internal working model matrix, okay? And it specifically says rather than roles, we track processes and resources. It says we're tracking our relational value and social influence. That's the core that we're tracking. Relational value is, hey, do you know, see me and value me? Social influence is, can I move you instrumentally in accordance with my desires? I'm tracking that. I'm tracking us vertically. So I'm exacting off of the space-time and I'll look up to you. Do I look up to you or look down at you? That's the vertical. And who has power in terms of control and rank? Every culture everywhere looks up to the authorities and down to the people beneath them. That's not something you learn, okay? And then connection-wise, I feel affiliation to you, okay, which means I share your interests, I have love feelings for you. Or the reverse, I split your interests off and see you as a threat, I feel hostility, okay? And then I track how involved are we? This is called the freedom or dependency line. So the matrix maps your power, love, and freedom on the dimension of relational value and social influence. And it says we humans have a sophisticated relationship system, just like Tomasello says, that collapses across the roles and orients towards the capacity to enter into a social influence matrix where we're tracking each other's space, subjective space, and building a self-other network, okay? And essentially implicitly dancing with each other, or not, okay? But have that capacity. So that's the other idea that puts humans in a particular relational space as a clinician, okay? As a psychotherapist, all right? We have control over the basic organism animal shit more than any other almost in history. In other words, we can control your pain, your pleasure, your food. What we also, though, have built is a weird-ass relational system in the world relative to what we expect, okay? We expect to be born into a tight-knit group where we know each other, about 150 people. We live our lives together. We hunt together, etc. There are places in hunter-gatherers, they put lots of constraints in about hierarchy, about competition, about who gets more shit. They bring us together. That's the environment we're expecting for our relational system. Our current environment is totally fucking different, okay? Technologically, socially, etc. I believe that the mismatch between our relational expectation, okay, what we're expecting to find ourselves in, and the current nature of the environment is causing a huge crisis in our emotional, social hearts. And we are. I just looked at the CDC data for teenage girls, okay? Just came out 2 days ago. 57% of teenage girls, 57, reported feeling depression to the point where they're impaired. Or in the last year, okay? That is astronomically high, okay? So what I would say is that what we're seeing here is we have created a socio-emotional environment that's enormously confusing. It's very difficult to find the resonance that it expects. And I can talk more about that, but fundamentally. So this is what's called your primate heart. Okay, so your primate heart needs to be seen, known, and valued. It needs a close connection. It needs to be socialized into a particular structure. We have failed on an enormous number of those counts, and all of a sudden the system is super freaked out. Okay, and then you say, well, why is it so out of whack? Well, because we built these systems of justification on the one hand. Okay, this gets to the last point, the joint point between us as minded animals. We're still primates doing this influence matrix stuff. Now, about 250,000 years ago, and certainly by 50,000 years ago, we get talking and propositions. There's a thing called the Justification Hypothesis in justification systems theory, and that specifies why the emergence of talking sparked the emergence of mind three in its particular domains and gives rise to the culture person plane of existence. That thing is evolving both through technology and through these systems of justification in a way that's totally outstripping our biological patterning. I mean, in terms of changes are happening generation to generation. Okay, we do not expect massive generation change. So ultimately, I offered a lot of commentary in there, but the last idea then, justification explains what causes go from primates to persons, cause the emergence of the culture person plane of existence. And, we're actually having a lot of problems right now in terms of the alignment of our basic structure of being And the world that we have created, even though we have a lot more biological and physical control, it seems like the psychosocial stuff is really buzzing in an ineffective or chaotic way.
Yeah, that CDC statistic is very alarming, and I think that what you're touching on is what has been kind of called the meaning crisis.
Yep.
So I'm wondering if, like, what do you think? Obviously, whatever the solution for the meaning crisis is not something that's simple, but how do we intervene, or how do we move ourselves out of this? What are some thoughts that you have on that?
Lovely. Yeah, so John Vervaeke obviously coined or became well known, certainly in the little circles that I operate in. He makes a really important point that what he's talking about in terms of the meaning crisis is a reframing. Like, people are seeking the meaning of life in the one hand, and they're gripping it and living it in ways that are fundamentally unsatisfying. And what he said, actually, what the task fundamentally is about finding meaning in life. Okay? So if one of the first issues is it's not so much resolving what the ultimate purpose of the universe is, at least from John, and I support this, but the real question, fundamental question, is what's meaning in life? Okay? And this is, what do you have contact with that's real, that's true, good, and beautiful, that makes all of the annoyances of life, which are inevitable, and the suffering, the fact we're all going to die, worth it. That feels that fundamental engagement. And he's arguing that we're facing a crisis because we've lost a lot of the old narrative that gave us some answers to the meaning of life. That now has been obliterated, but we haven't situated ourselves to afford us a meaning in life. Okay? All right. So, and then we see underneath the meaning crisis is an understandable then mental health crisis. Okay? All right. So a mental health crisis then at a evidence level, I just point to the numbers of individuals that are not satisfied with life, engaged in suicidal ideation, anxiety, depression, etc. And those now, in our youth, those are skyrocketing by far to never seen. So I would say it's just an empirical fact. We can decide what's the best way to frame it, but it's an empirical fact that there's skyrocketing levels of anxiety and depression and suicidal behavior in our youth. Okay? And that's sad, because that's diagnostic of suffering. And then we ask, well, why is that the case? Okay? Well, there's a huge number of possible answers. I'll just give you one, and we'll see where to go. Okay? Remember I talked about the influence matrix, okay? So the influence matrix, in fact, it took me a little while to decipher that the heart of the influence matrix is called the black line. That means what you're tracking in the world. And it's got two sides to it. One is social influence, I mentioned. So social influence is the capacity to move other people in accordance with your interests, okay? It's instrumental, okay? It's like, hey. The other is relational value. That's being seen, known, and valued by important others. Okay? Let's just take that. What we have created with capitalism, and then especially into social media, okay, is basically a dominant form of social influence as the primary capital. How much money do you have? How much status do you have? How many followers do you have? Okay? In other words, what we have highlighted as desirable is high social influence, stripping the structure for relational value, to be seen, known, and valued in the intimate, embodied, real world that you would normally encounter over living with people for a long period of time. So now we can isolate kids in their rooms, on their screens, trying to get access to likes and attention, and watching the influencers, notice the term, influencers, right? And even if you're an influencer, guess what? You have audience capture, meaning that you'll get influenced because you have a nice body or you do something really weird, and then there's fun, and now you have influence, and now to get influence, you have to be that way, regardless of what your heart is. And so now across many, many different domains, we've split out social influence as an instrumental, cut it off from relational value, and then gave people either the option to have no social influence and feel like shit, or have social influence but essentially be an imposter and a slave to what the categories are and feel like shit. Not a good option, okay? So that's just one example about once you have this lens to diagnose, oh my God, our hearts need to be seen, known, and valued by important others. We better create a world where kids are socialized not just to know propositionally what to do in the world so they get a job. We better create a world where families and communities are bringing kids in the world so that the first issue, the first psychological nourishment that we are attending to is to the extent to which those kids are seen, known, and valued by important others. And every step of the way has got to be structured to cultivate the seen, known, and valued. And if we misconstrue seen, known, and valued for social influence and getting money to have a job to move other people around, we have fundamentally played with the soul of our human children. And we have fundamentally misconstrued its nature as an instrumental structure as opposed to something that actually is about being in the world in right connection as a real human being with unique capacities and attributes and embodied in a way that needs to be loved.
Yeah, I think you're really hitting the nail on the head with this framing. And this is kind of showing how you can use something like this piece of the theory, which is the influence matrix, to look at the meaning crisis and to see that there's social influence and relational value, and it's out of whack, it's imbalanced, and we're kind of wired to need a high level of relational value, and now we're kind of neglecting that, not getting that, and going after social influence exclusively, and that's not able to fulfill us. So it's really interesting how you use that to it seems more like a grounded and practical example, and I'm actually curious if you can maybe give some more examples how you would use the other pieces in a practical way, how somebody could use this framework, clinicians or people, anybody who's interested in the mind and psychology and these
Absolutely.
kind of processes, how they could use them.
Sure. Actually, to do that, I'll just say, let's use, so the justification model gives rise to just a way of thinking about your domains of human consciousness. Okay, let's start there. Okay. So the first domain of human consciousness that you can, if you're an adult and you're listening to this, you can say, here, I am listening to this podcast and I'm wondering what I think about it. That is your private ego. Okay. The private ego is self-reflecting on your experience of being and talking to yourself about how you make sense out of it. That's your private ego. Okay. Now, you're existing inside of your felt experience of being. You have your mind to experiential self. Okay. Your mind to experiential self is if you're driving or you open your eyes, your vision will see shit. You'll hear shit. Okay. And that gives you what's called pure awareness. That's your sensation into perceptual field. And then you're gripping that with feelings. Okay. Okay. So you're gripping that. Hey, do I want this? Do I like this? That's the gripping function. Okay. Your core self. So when I talked about your primate heart, think about the times in which you have been loved versus rejected. Okay. So like I can identify in my history. I was like, we were, the second time we won the trophy when I was one of my great sporting events, I was 12. My dad was the coach. I was the goalie. It was to win the championship trophy. We were up 1-0. There's a breakaway. I'm the goalie. I save it. It kicks in. I save it again. I grab the thing and whoa. It was hard. We won, and I remember it to this day because I could see my dad and the whole cheer go. It was my great sporting event. There it is. I'm not an athlete. Okay. But there it is. Why do I remember that? Because I did something difficult that other people loved me for. I also remember the times that, I tried to ask some girls out and they were like, I'd never fucking date you. I remember that too. Okay. All right. So we want to know what all I'm saying is pay attention to just the sensory input structure. That's called your pure awareness. And then your emotional feeling structure. Okay. Gives you pleasure, pain, and in your primate heart particular. Then you have your ego. And then you're managing your persona. Your persona is, hey, how do other people going to see me? What's my reputation? How am I publicly going to try to regulate my identity relative to how you're going to see me? Okay. So when you look psychotherapeutically, when I look at psychotherapeutically, if you come in and start talking to me, okay, the first thing that I'm tracking is what's your persona? What's your ego? What are you seeing in the world from pure awareness? And where's your heart? Okay, that's the part that's gripping. So at a practical level, you can just watch your consciousness. You can learn to watch your consciousness. Okay? So that's the first thing. It's like, there's my pure awareness. There's my gripping emotional heart. There's my justifying ego. And here's how I regulate myself personally. Okay? My friends who I was trying to explain this, so you say, so you're saying I got my monkey, My monkey trainer, that's my talking, and my monkey PR guy. Yeah, your monkey PR guy, monkey trainer, and your felt monkey. Okay. Now, what happens to people, okay, is that their monkey trainer, as they try to manage their monkey PR, can get super pissed at the monkey. Right? Has anybody been a parent, or anybody had a puppy, or anybody witnessed themselves emotionally behave in such a way that you didn't like at all? You can get super annoyed, okay? There are a lot of people that get a monkey trainer that get what's called, a part of them gets what's called the critic, okay? The critic gets super pissed at the monkey, all right? What it does is it gets frustrated with that you're not able to produce the shit that you want in the world, and then you feel bad about it, and you start hating on the world and your feelings. That's the critic, okay? So I built a model called neurotic loops, all right? Neurotic loop is when you get hit with a negative situation. You have a normal monkey negative feeling reaction, and then the monkey trainer, especially the critic part of the monkey trainer, goes, this fucking sucks, I hate this, and I'm going to try to control, I'm going to try to avoid, I'm going to try to blame the self, okay? So it's this secondary reaction to the pairing of the bad situation that hits your negative feelings, and then you get the secondary critic reaction, okay? Because this justifying system is trying to regulate your PR and is super pissed that it can't control it. So it internalizes the judgments of others and starts attacking the self. It's called the interject when it's negative, all right? So the unified theory, this little black dot here on the tree of life, okay, for YouTube, that little black dot there, that refers to a symbol of mindedness and mindfulness, not mindedness, mindfulness. And what I teach people to do is I teach them how to step outside and observe their negative situation, negative feeling, and critic. Okay? And I help them see that the critic makes sense. The critic wants to do certain things that make sense. They want to prevent you from stuff, want to get you achieving, but it's also doing it in a way that is attacking and constraining and destructive. Okay? So then what we do is we pull out what I call the COM-MO flashlight, okay? And you get a metacognitive view on that critic. Metacognitive means you step outside and then become the observation. MO, a metacognitive observer. And rather than being a critic that's critical and resistant and irritable and tense and insistent and controlling, by the way, that spells critic, and you help people see that you are that way, then you can flash a COM-MO flashlight and replace that attitude with one that's curious, accepting, loving, compassionate, and motivated toward valued states of being. And that's the attitude when negative situations hit negative feelings. What you want to be is you want to be curious, accepting, loving, compassionate, and motivated toward valued states of being. You want to be consistent, controlling, and critical of the whole thing. If you are, that's going to trap you. So this is another example that basically says, hey, you can apply this model. There's an enormous wisdom of psychotherapy that I just sort of summarized there that many other people have said. I can apply the model, take the wisdom from a wide variety of different perspectives, consolidate it, and then hand it to people in a way that says, oh, rather than activate the critic, turn on your COM-MO flashlight and help get in right relationship to the negative situation, negative feeling, and then hold the culture person plane in a much more wise, adaptive, mature way, rather than getting sucked. That mind 3 can get sucked into the misery of mind 1 and 2, and then you're in a vicious neurotic loop, feedback loop. We can use this model to help people diagnose those neurotic loops and untangle them and be much more reciprocally open and engaged, flexible, and adaptive.
Yeah, so the question that I kind of have now is, right, taking this model and introducing it to clinicians and being like, here's this model. How would this model make clinicians better? It could be new clinicians. It could be clinicians that have been practicing for a long time. They're maybe familiar with different methods, and they're doing, they're getting good results in their therapy sessions, whatever. But how would this framework potentially make a clinician better? And why would it be important for a clinician to take the time to learn this framework?
Sure. So my day job is teaching doctoral level psychologists, and I've been doing that since 2003. And I do it in a unique and integrative program that cuts across a wide variety of different perspectives and integrates them so you can see the whole person. So I do this. This is my job, and I teach people how to do this at high levels so they can be And COMMO has become part of the whole lexicon inside the program, precisely because it's a quick and easy way to lens into what many people, psychotherapists, are doing, and just makes it concrete, and makes it interface with lots of different language systems, psychodynamic language systems, which focus on awareness and the internal working models like that influence matrix stuff, cognitive behavioral, especially what's called third wave cognitive behavioral ACT. If you've heard of ACT at all, acceptance and commitment therapy, well, that's the A, acceptance in calm, and motivated toward valued states of being is essentially that. But the CBT people don't really know how to shine the light on defenses and subconscious, self-conscious stuff. They're not really great at that. And they're not really great at relationships. Psychodynamic people are great at relationships and defenses, but they don't shine the light enough on habits and justifications. So I teach people how to translate all the schools of thought, put them in a relationship that doesn't commit to a school of thought, but shows the insights, because it's more important to be, rather than commit to gurus, folks, we should commit to actual insights, and we should have cumulative insights that lead to useful grounding. I was president of the Society for the Exploration of Psychotherapy Integration this past year, and my theme was toward a common core. And the common core was first realized that all good therapy begins with Rogers, okay? We know psychotherapy is key to understand a relationship. You ground the relationship and cultivate hope in people. You cultivate a shared understanding. You cultivate motivated toward outcomes. That's the first thing. And then what we should do for the internalizing adult conditions, which are the largest portion of bringing people in, internalize, that's anxiety, depression, low self-esteem, okay? Internalizing, what's internal, that critic on that emotional system is causing a negative feedback, a problematic maladaptive feedback loop. Okay. And basically, we want to create a loving relationship that shifts from blaming, avoiding, and controlling. That's the general pattern. Okay. And opens that system up that's curious, accepting, loving, compassionate, and motivated. And you can apply this through many different lenses. My basic point was like, yeah, that's the common core way of framing what is at the heart of what all the wisdom of psychotherapy has been saying. And my framing is, hey, why don't we trade that then? Why don't we start with the heart of the set of insights that's useful, transferable? And the last thing I'll say is I actually gave up my license to be a clinician, in part because I'm actually, I am deeply concerned about the institutionalization of health and mental health, okay? All right, so the issue, we do not want this knowledge to be cloistered into a professional relationship alone, okay? This knowledge should not be something that we should be like, oh, your therapist knows this, your mom should know this, you should know this, the school should know this, the community should know this, everyone should be wandering around. You don't need a licensed clinical psychologist to have a COMMO flashlight, okay? Every system should know that we care, our heart needs relational value. Every system should know our head can attack a situation and a feeling system because we're trying to regulate our reputation. Everyone should know if you're temporarily neurotic, which means you'll have a high negative affect system, it's going to be harder to calm. And should bring a calm system to metabolize that. That should not be a doctoral level clinician knowledge. That should be sixth grader knowledge. Okay? And actually, we're unbelievably confused about how to understand this. My kids went through all K through 12, all three of them, went through K through 12 public education, and I don't think they got an hour's worth of education on what an emotion is. What the fuck is going on? I mean, we're having emotional crises, and we have 12 years to educate my kids, and you don't spend one damn hour telling them what emotion is, how to hold an emotion relative to your head, how to regulate it in relationship to other people, when we could just tell them, actually, what you don't want to do is you want to triple negative neurotic loop that thing. You want a COMMO flashlight. That should be common knowledge.
Yeah, I mean, that definitely resonates with me. This whole aspect of not being taught what are emotions, what are thoughts, how does the system work, how does it feed back on itself. And it also ties in with this idea of like everybody should be their own psychologist. Like we should all study ourselves on that deep level and have that kind of understanding of the inner process and just like this basic experience that before we go out in the world and do anything else, you're dealing with emotions, you're dealing with thoughts on the very basic level, and that's very much neglected. I'm curious why you stepped away from being a clinician. Is because did that somehow hamper down you being able to spread this knowledge and spread this system?
Yeah, there's a long, complicated story that some of which is not, I'd have to tell you some other time. But a lot of it was I wanted to get into UTOK philosophical coaching. So I've started UTOK philosophical coaching. It's complicated to be a licensed clinical psychologist in relationship to that. So that was one of the big motives. And the second motive was really also that I really wanted to make this shift explicit in people. Okay. And basically, I used to be a huge critic of psychiatry. All right. So psychiatry was one of my, especially for neurotic conditions and managing kid behavior, the idea of throwing pills at shit and label them with medical kind of disorders. We went crazy on that stuff. And that was, and I want to hold psychiatry accountable for it. Okay. I've gotten increasingly frustrated, quite frankly, with my own institution. Okay. Psychology. I grew up in it. I love it. I think it's super important. But the entire construction of psychology as an institution is something that I'm actually pissed off about. Okay. And I think it's wrongly structured for the time. I think it's wrongly structured in the way it gives information to the culture. And I think this culture is digesting its material in problematic ways. Okay. Like once you learn COM-MO, psychotherapy, then you shouldn't be on Psychology Today trying to get the latest little thing about something. In other words, Psychology Today, you can read, and I am a blogger. I love blogging on Psychology Today at one level. But you see all of this endless shit about the next 5 things for this, and 5 things to gaslighting, blah, blah, blah. Man, and it's just this one little, piece of information contextualized and another piece of information and another piece of information. And sure, some people can use that for utility. But when I look at sort of like, you're going to give an average person, and I don't mean that pejoratively, just background knowledge. You come in and you're like, how am I supposed to fucking understand this? Okay. And this is very frustrating to me. It's like, we don't even know mindedness. Okay. We haven't even conveyed that you walk into the woods and when your kid at 4 says, oh, Dad, look at the birds and the bees, and knows instantaneously that they behave differently than the plants, we call that animal behavior rather than minded animals. Right from the beginning. And now what is us that makes us different, and how do we actually relate to the world? Our entire system of knowledge, in my estimation, is essentially a strewn information formed by studies, formed by people's own definitional systems that actually create, in many ways, more chaotic, fragmented problems than they actually solve. So for me, part of my old mission here is like, hey, folks, we're doing this entire institution wrong. I've gotten further and further away from the institution and basically waving over here going, I think we took a wrong turn 120 years ago. We should have done this 120 years ago. And if we had, our relationship with the mental health crisis would be radically different. If we just turned out COM-MO flashlights, you're in good shape. That's 90% of it consolidated. That's what we should be handing out. The consolidated core of what we know in a way that's clear.
Yeah, thank you for speaking on this. I feel like I have a lot of resonance with this as well, and the problems with the institution, problem with kind of DSM model, and I can see how being in that profession would have you in a chokehold, and I see how you've kind of like started to expand and move really out of that box, outside of that box, and maybe this is a good part to kind of say what the unified theory of knowledge adds on top of unified theory of psychology, and like what is this new? Because I know you're speaking a lot more about this unified theory of knowledge. Like and you said you're stepping into like this philosophical coaching with it. So maybe speak a little bit more on that.
Sure. So mostly of what we covered is, I mentioned it was mid-1990s. I discovered the problem of psychotherapy. Then I had a couple of insights in my whole career up to, say, 2011, and I wrote my first book. Okay, the first book I wrote is on a new unified theory of psychology, and we talked about the 4 key elements. And in this time in my life, I'm like, hey, I want to upgrade psychology. Okay, I'm inside the institution trying to do that. From 2011 to 2016, I built what would become the unified approach. Okay, the unified approach is all that COM-MO stuff. I modeled character, development, well-being, and mindfulness. That's what so what's character and how do you adapt to the world? What's development? What are the domains of human development? How do we understand those in basic mapping structure? How do we understand what well-being is? And how do we cultivate a healthy, psychologically sophisticated approach to mindfulness? That's CalmMO. Okay. So I did that from 2011 to 2016. And so by 2016, I essentially solved my original problem. All right. Which was, hey, how do I, as an adult clinician, feel like I'm got a model that's up to the task scientifically and at the level of clear values that specifies what my role is in general, so I can bring generalized specific knowledge to say, you, if you're my client, hey, Artem, what's your story? Who are you? You're the expert on you. What's your unique element? How do I navigate generalized intelligence, generalized values about what is good, connect with your unique position? And what if you're a woman from Saudi Arabia? All of that complexity has got to be managed. So in 2016, I felt like I more or less solved that problem. I was like, I know what it is to be a psychological doctor. I've demonstrated, I was director of this program. I demonstrated how to train psychological doctors that had a cultivated identity, and I was in good shape. That's what I thought I'd be doing. 2016 happened, though, and my system took off another domain. I was at a conference put on my, at the time, friend Craig Henriques, called Cultivating the Globally Sustainable Self. Say that again. Cultivating the Globally Sustainable Self, 2016. And what he brought in was a bunch of transformational educators and psychologists and a few other people from around the world, lovely people, brilliant people doing brilliant work. And we had a great conference, 350 people there at the conference. At the end of that conference, he had a panel discussion where he asked the panel, he had brought all the heavy hitters in and brought them in. It's like, so how do we do this, guys? And no disrespect, but I thought the answers were basically shitty, okay? And essentially they all, and I got to appreciate why, oh, that's a really complicated question. How do you cultivate the globally sustainable self? I have my piece of what I do transformational education in, say, Nigeria, but that doesn't mean that I know what the hell I'm doing in the cultivating globally sustainable self. That's fair enough. But when you saw all the 5 panel members or whatever talk, I was then with a friend of mine, and I built this UT, Unified Theory, and UA system, Unified Approach. And I was like, we should plant a tua seeds and grow a tua trees. Okay? Well, that was a light bulb moment, okay? Plant a tua seeds. So I had a tua, that was the UTUA. And ultimately, it gave rise to this thing. So for the next 8 months, I was obsessed with building what would become the garden, okay? So the garden takes all these ideas and then puts it in this depiction, all right, of a garden. Now, this was very symbolic, of course. My first set of insights is organized by the tree of knowledge, which is this first branch, and then it grows into a garden. So my message to people is, hey, we can eat off the tree of knowledge. It's troublesome because we have to come to terms with our scientific reality as apes who are trying to justify good and evil. But if we do, we can now return to the garden and potentially flourish if we understand how to live wisely. And I now think I can contribute to living wisely through the lens of psychotherapy. And this creates a whole different platform, not psychotherapy anymore. This is a platform for education in the way Zach Stein means education, which is the grounding structures of knowledge that afford the wisdom of the older generation to be conferred in right relationship to the new generation. And so I essentially saw the garden as a collective wisdom structure that could contribute to organizing knowledge across the sciences and humanities in a coherent way and afford us an understanding about how we would educate our kids all the way from kindergarten, okay, to teaching them to get PhDs in physics. That's the garden is a structure that can move from kindergarten, okay, where we'd have trees and bees and rocks, etc., and then it would grow into a structure where you'd learn more and more about all of our knowledge domains in a way that's relatively coherent, okay? So the garden then is this educational structure. Ultimately, in 2018, I then developed what I call the path out of the garden, and that evolves into this thing called the iQuad coin, okay? The iQuad coin, this is in the shape of an H, okay? And if you rotate it, it becomes an I, and that stands for your human identity function, okay? And on the backside is the tree of life. And what this does is it creates a conduit from each of our subjectivities defined as your particular human identity function and mine that then connects it to the tree of life. Okay? So ultimately, UTOK fundamentally then is about taking science mapped by the tree of knowledge. Okay? Taking collective wisdom living wisely mapped by the garden and our unique subjective experience of being and tying them together through a coin, tree relation, okay? And what that does is it says, oh, there's now a network association between unique subjectivity, collective wisdom, and science. And that's the unified theory of knowledge, which is basically like, wow, we never had that before. We never had any system that actually, that's the Enlightenment Gap. Remember science versus social and subjective knowledge, mind matter. We don't have anything that ties together all these different perspectives in a way that even is remotely coherent. Well, the unified theory of knowledge says, well, I'm not saying it's done by any stretch, but I am saying we're starting anew because we can get qualitatively better coherence now than we've ever had before. And unified is a word from consilience in Edward Wilson's Consilience. And so now we can actually have coherent interrelation between science, subjectivity, and collective wisdom in a way that we've never achieved before. That's what I mean by unified theory of knowledge.
Yeah, so I read the 2011 book, Unified Theory of Psychology in depth, and I haven't really had a chance to dive into the new book, but is that where you really kind of unpack these other pieces of UTOK?
No, that will be next. This book deepens this argument, all right? So this argument is what I call the meta theory argument. Meta theory is like, okay, how do we take a deep dive and build back and understand the theoretical, which are causal explanatory structures that can organize psychology, okay? There's actually an even deeper problem called the metaphysics problem. The metaphysics problem is the core meaning of our terms like mind and behavior and science, okay? This book, 500 pages, delineates how to think about mind, behavior, and science. Okay. And thus it basically, so now what you get is here's a you think I'd be able to hold it, right? The meta theory and metaphysical unification. My next book, and this doesn't mention the coin or the tree, the garden or the coin at all, but I will hand people both. Okay. The garden and the coin are just weird the institution of knowledge that, I'm a lifelong professor. It's just so far outside of like, what do you peer review? You're going to peer review this weird iQuad coin? So this is an academic argument to the literature. I need to figure out a way. I need to build all this landscape and then basically say, all right, here I am, folks, shaman on a hill. And there's a pathway here that's really a new kind of knowledge that doesn't have a lineage. You don't do a lit review on the iQuad coin. Okay. So essentially, I'm now at the place where I've made my academic argument, grounded my structure, and now I'm building the UTOK language system with the coin, garden, tree. And I'll be writing about that next, okay? Because the levels of abstraction here are very high, and they're not really grounded in historical trajectories. They're very novel, and I have to then figure out a way to legitimately talk about them, or else any normal academic will hear me go, that guy's a quack, What the hell is he talking about? There's no institutional tradition here. It's like, actually, there is. I'm just far the hell out there. But that doesn't necessarily mean I'm a quack, so.
Yeah. I'm going to dive into the second book and waiting for the third one as well. I really appreciate all these pieces that you're putting together. And actually, I think you're very like rigorous in making all of this very scientific and grounded in empirical evidence. And speaking about being far out, maybe this is the last question that I can ask. Where does, having this unified theory of psychology, where does transpersonal psychology fit in? How important is it for clinicians to kind of understand these transpersonal and spiritual experiences? And just where does that fit in?
Totally. I will say, I'll just to pick up on, I'll tell everybody here, I'm actually enormously conservative. Okay. And I take basically consensual knowledge, standard theory of elementary particle physics, a consensual model of Big Bang, a consensual model across a wide variety of different things. And I'm just organizing them in new ways. So if anybody hears woo from me, you're probably not hearing me correct, okay? Because I'm grounded in what's called an endo-natural perspective that bottoms out in the appreciation of natural science as affording us a particular powerful epistemology that I call structural realism. That's from other people, but basically it's like there's a lot of knowledge that science gave us. It's brilliant knowledge, it's powerful knowledge. I'm extending that with just clarity about what was confusing in the past and a conservative light. So that's one comment I'll make about, if you're wondering about my stuff, it's actually enormously conservative. Secondly, this transpersonal thing is a really, really important point. Let's just make it, grounded, okay? So I have my everyday ego concerns, okay? I was like, hey, how am I getting along with my girlfriend? How am I getting along with my parents? Are my parents going to have Alzheimer's? Blah, blah, blah. What am I doing? Do I have enough money, etc.? Do people like me? Do people care about me? Okay? Totally reasonable. At the same time, that's one particular perspective of egoic concerns on the world, right? So if you're just basically, all you need to do is you need to step out and say, from any kind of generalized view, you have your concerns and I have my concerns. Why am I invested in my concerns more than your concerns? Well, I'm embodied in mine. But if we say, hey, your concerns are as important as mine, right? Then all of a sudden, well, if other people's concerns are generally as important at the level of there's no real grounding that other than my unique positionality, what you're starting to do is you're starting to take a transpersonal attitude. Okay? And we desperately need this. Another one of the things that our modern empirical society did is a sort of like, well, it's just ration, reason, instrumental control. No. There's an egoic self-frame on the world, which is important and useful, but there's a trans-egoic frame on the world, okay? And that trans-egoic frame is ultimately, we have to achieve a transcendent relationship with our egoic justifications with what would be spiritually possible, okay? So I use the word soul. I'm ensouled in the world. This is from Zach Time also, but I have spiritual concerns, which are the forms of the thing called an elephant sun god. The elephant sun god represents the ultimate good. My little concerns are good and important, but geez, so are yours. Okay? We need frameworks that enable us to see the generalized good. All right? And I could speak a lot more to that, but that's a general point, is that we absolutely need to recognize what is an egoic, what's a pre-egoic state, to use a little bit of Ken Wilber's lingers, and what's a trans-egoic, okay? And we need to make a pre-trans fallacy. We need to be clear about pre-egoic, egoic, and trans. And we need to cultivate a trans-egoic identity, okay? I stumbled into a thing called wisdom energy in late October 2020. Had about a 2-week transformational experience. Where for about 2 weeks, I plugged into the concept of wisdom energy. And to give you just basically my I-Quad coin, my Gregg Henriques, somehow, and I can tell you that, but basically a series of events aligned so that all of a sudden I felt completely aligned with bang, the Big Bang energy, and the concept of God, wisdom. And my system was in direct harmony with that relation. So it's called it wisdom energy. And my system was metabolized. I probably walked 70 miles around my neighborhood that week because I just walked. And every step felt in right relation. The bees and the birds and the dogs and everybody that I saw was like, this is the way it should be, okay? And I felt the love dissipate through me, and my everyday concerns dropped out, and there was a richness and multiplicity. At the same time, I felt sense of oneness. Okay. And what I became was, sort of like, oh my God, it was like this beam of wisdom energy. My system now somehow found right relation. Okay. That is a kind of transformational experience, all right, that I think is certainly many people, if you have a transcendent experience, they will have a lot of these qualities. Okay. We can cultivate these qualities. It's a particular kind of state in the world. And I'll simply say this as we begin to wrap up. According to the unified theory, we're going through a major transition right now, okay? So we remember we said life, mind, culture, all right? Well, Each one of those, in the nutshell, is a new information processing and communication network. DNA, cell-by-cell communication. Nervous system, neuroinformation processing, animal-animal communication. Human language, propositional networking, human-to-human communication. Are there any other novel information processing and communication networks that we're looking around lately? That have appeared lately? Okay. Computers, artificial intelligence. We have now built a bridge to the material culture so that they now engage in information interface. Rocks did not engage in information interface. We did start writing, that was the early, but now they can actually engage in computation. And Jesus, we have neural links, we have ChatGPT, and it's just going to get more. We're in the midst of a massive transformation because of another information processing communication network. I call this the fifth joint point. We better get right relation to our living world, the natural world, Mother Earth, our embodied mindedness as primates, our cultured persons, both situated in the world and cosmologically connected, and in relationship to this emerging digital technology. And you better have a transpersonal sense, a trans-egoic justificatory sense of what is good if we're actually going to fly through this crazy time and do so and get to the other side and have some stability. So a transpersonal view is central for the fifth joint point, and we need to figure out how to connect the ego to a transpersonal egoic view and have more people be able to do that, not in a way that's arrogant or look down on others, but if you're in right relationship to that, you actually become one with more and more things in the universe.
Yeah, that's very comprehensive overview, and I just love how you tie all those pieces together. I really appreciate your work, and I'm glad that I put the time in to learn the model. And we kind of move around in similar spaces. You've spoken to a lot of people that I've spoken to on my podcast, and, you call it the liminal space, the meta modern space. But there's also another piece with me being kind of entrenched in the mental health field and working with clinicians. So there's a lot of overlap in that. And I would actually love to have another conversation with you, maybe to go deeper into the unified approach and how you actually think about psychotherapy, because
Sure.
I'm very curious about that. So I think that would be a great conversation. Also, maybe speaking more about kind of what's wrong with the institution of psychology and kind of the chokeholds that are there and the limitations and how we could override them. So, but yeah, I really appreciate you coming on. Yeah.
Hey, thank you. I really appreciate it. I appreciate your questions. It enabled me to surf through this very complicated material in a way that I thought was rich and coherent. So I really appreciate your guiding that work or that process very much.
Yeah. Thanks so much, Gregg, and be in contact, and hopefully we'll speak soon again.
Amen. I'd welcome that. You take care.
Thank you.